Today, we'll be taking a look back at some of the stocks I've talked about in the past 6 weeks. In particular, we'll be taking a look at the trend lines and how they've held up over time. So if you take a look at the screen, you'll see these purple arrows here. Now these signify when the videos I made on these stocks came out and when I talked about them. They usually also signify when I drew these, when I drew these trend lines, or at least the latest date of which I've drew them. Just digging myself into a hole here. Anyway, the first stock we'll be taking a look at is Alibaba. I talked about Alibaba at the beginning of November, and it has since dropped, and I talked about it again on the 18th of November, somewhere around there. And you can see that these trend lines that were already drawn previously during that time, at the beginning of November, have held up really well with the price action, as unexpected as they were. Now, this is not the case with all China stocks, as in the next stock here on Huya, I've had to change a couple of trend lines since I talked about it in the videos. Of particular note is this trend line here, which I actually had horizontally, which lopped the heads off some of these humps here. I've also added in one of these trend lines here, but I'd say I'd still have to take a closer look. I'm pretty happy with them, but we'll have to see how they hold up. On the other end of the spectrum from Huya is Woof. Woof did really well. My trend lines held up beautifully to the price action. The only thing I'd say is the Fibonacci retracement doesn't quite capture it accurately. It's in the ballpark, but it isn't quite at the level of yes, it'll fall down exactly to $18.50. Rather, it says, oh, it's around $19 where it will bounce. I mean, it did. There are a couple of trend lines that are sort of hard trend lines, like this $23 line I've drawn in here. When I talked about it, we had no idea that after earnings it would drop so much. But when it did drop, it dropped straight to that line of support there and turned it into resistance. So that's an example of good line drawing. Now, Tesla is in a bit of a unique situation compared to the other stocks because most of these trend lines have been drawn months back rather than weeks back, as with the other stocks. Now, when I talked about Tesla, all these lines were there already, but recently I've added in this trend line highlighted in red just to reflect the short-term price action, I should say, in the past couple of weeks. I really should draw in another line somewhere around here, sort of creating that wedge pattern that we are so used to seeing in Tesla stocks. But that aside, of the lines that have been drawn in the past couple months already, and that have been holding up for the past couple months, we see that Tesla is still sort of bouncing in between the line here highlighted in red and this one in the lower regions. So I'd be interested to see how those hold up in the coming weeks with the market volatility. Moving on to the smaller cap stocks is MindMed. When I talked about them, I said that they would fall, and they did. However, I had this trend line here a little offset, so it didn't quite capture that move down. It didn't quite predict where it would find a level of support. I've since changed that to reflect the actual price action. But this line here was, well, I mean, it was very accurate. Even more accurate would be Palantir, which has followed the trend lines to a T, actually. You can see that it had this massive head and shoulders forming, and it bounced, or I drew it in there, but it bounced right at the $18 level trend line of support that I've drawn in, and is coming back down to test it, perhaps going down all the way to that $16 line there as predicted by the head and shoulders. So it has been very accurate. We'll have to see if it continues to follow those trend lines. Moving back to a bigger cap stock, Tencent, when I talked about it, it was bouncing around in this pennant shape here, and it has faithfully followed that thus far, and is still trying to test that lower resistance line there after breaking down. Triterras, a SPAC, has been following those trend lines well as well. For some reason, I find that smaller cap stocks as well as SPACs follow trend lines exceedingly well, whereas another larger cap stock like Woof is a little iffy sometimes. Quite a few China stocks. This is another NIO. NIO has also been following the trend lines quite well, and it seems ready to retest that lower support line and perhaps break down. We'll have to see. Macy's is kind of like Woof. I've had to add in this line here, and it has kind of followed the Fibonacci retractment I've drawn in prior. But I think the reason it hasn't quite followed everything I've said is because these lines I drew in are spanning a couple of years rather than a couple of months like the other stocks. So to actually get an idea of how well Macy's has been following my trend lines, you'd have to go out a couple of years. So I should really look into drawing a few more short-term trend lines in the next several weeks or months. Last but not least, we have DraftKings. DraftKings is another stock that has been following those trend lines really quite well. After I drew in those lines of support and resistance, it has bounced right at that line of support and is coming back down to test it. This line here, highlighted in red, may be a weaker resistance and support line there, but this one is much stronger, as you can see. Anyway, that concludes my review of stocks I've talked about in the past 6 weeks. Most of them have been fairly accurate. The only ones that I've really had to fix were Huya, which made a deep impression, as well as Woof. Well, Woof was accurate, but I feel like I could have done better. I mean, the only other one is Macy's, which is a longer term horizon. and a bit of a touch up on Mind Med, where I've had to change this line. So sort of 3 out of 11 that needed a bit of work is not bad. I hope this has been helpful, and happy trading.